side of my sculptural practice, I'm making a lot of things where I'm taking components and building with them in a very organized kind of mechanical way that I think is a little reminiscent of construction toys, but also with clay being the material that I'm using, there's a lot of crystal and crystal formation, geological references, that sort of thing. So that's sort of what's going on here. And then over here is the other side of my practice where I have all of these bins around my studio. Actually, I brought a couple of them with me. So I have all these bins around my studio that I think of as little toy boxes, essentially. And they are full of different components that I will end up using in my work at different points. So some of them are bits that are unfired and bone dry, and others are, like a lot of stuff on this piece came from a box that is things that have, like delicate pieces that have broken off of previous pieces, or whole pieces that have been scrapped and need to be repurposed. So, yes.
Did you make the things that are in those boxes?
Yeah.
You made all of that?
Yeah. Well, I got super lucky this year, and I had a studio assistant from KCAI who actually made a lot of these components, but historically I've made them. Oh yeah, and as we go, if you have questions, please just shout them out. I like to do conversational demos. So to start with, there's a couple of different things about paper clay that set it apart from the normal way that you would work with ceramics. And while I talk about that technical stuff that I think is interesting but not very visually stimulating, I'm just going to add some things to this. So one of the major rules about clay is that once it's dry, it's pretty much past the point where you can work with it. There are things that you can still do to bone dry clay a little bit, like you can take a wet sponge to it and smooth it out, that sort of thing, but you're not going to really be able to rehydrate it back to the point where it's workable. You can try to add things to bone dry clay, but if you do, you will often run into an issue where when you try to attach a new wet piece of clay to the dry surface is just going to suck all of the moisture right out of that wet piece, and instead of attaching, the wet piece is just going to fall off of the dry piece. You can try to rehydrate the dry piece, but a lot of the time that water is not going to sink deep enough into it to actually get it wet. And the same thing will happen, they'll just pop apart. So the first major thing that is different from regular clay about working with paper clay is that you are able to attach wet and dry pieces to each other. And the reason that this works is because of what the paper clay is made up of. So paper clay is basically just any clay recipe that you're using with the addition of fiber. And that can be a lot of different things. If you're making it yourself at home, which a lot of people do, toilet paper and newspaper are good candidates for fibers that you can find pretty easily. And basically, the idea is that by adding fiber to your clay, you are giving it structure that it wouldn't otherwise have. So what the fiber is doing is it's creating a network within the clay that helps to increase the dry strength of the clay, and it also helps to carry water through it. So the reason, or one of the main reasons, that you're able to attach wet clay to dry clay with paper clay is that there's not just clay particles in there to hold the water, there's this capillary system of fibers running through it that want to take that water from the surface and automatically suck it in a little deeper and hold on to it. You do, when you're working this way, and this depends on your clay a little bit, something that I have learned is that the type of clay that you're using for your paper clay recipe affects the way that you have to work with it to an extent. So whenever I'm attaching a new piece of clay to something that's totally bone dry, I do like to slip and score it a little bit. And this is because a lot of the time the paper clay likes to grab on to things that are dry, but it really likes to grab on to a surface that isn't smooth. And one of the major differences that I have noticed with this, because I work with both high fire and mid-range clays, is that porcelain in particular is very finicky about wanting to attach to dry clay even when it has paper in it. I don't know why that is. I think that porcelain just thinks that it's special. It does also, the porcelain that I use has a lot less grog in it, which is, grog is clay that has already been fired and then ground up, and you can add it to a clay body that you're using to help reduce shrinkage, because clay shrinks when it's fired, so by adding particles to it that have already been fired, you have particles in there that aren't going to shrink, reducing the overall shrinkage of the whole thing. And grog also has the advantage, depending on what you're doing, of being very rough. So when I am working with paper clay, most of the time I do like to have grog in my clay. But if it's porcelain, that can be kind of a trade-off, because then you don't get the sort of smooth texture that you would normally associate with that. So the difference with that is that you just have to sort of figure out how to work with this. So what I'm doing right here is I'm building this piece with rods that are made of paper clay, that are completely bone dry, and then I'm using a slip that also has paper in it to stick them together. And the reason that I'm building with them bone dry has to do with two things. It has to do with structural integrity and shrinkage. So I tried for a couple of years a while back to figure out how to make structures like this without using paper clay, because I just didn't know that you were allowed to. And the issue that I kept running into is that when your clay is leather hard, it's it's at a state where it's stiff, but it's still a little bit flexible, and this is generally when you would want to attach two things to each other. What you run into with this, however, is that as you're building, different parts are going to start to shrink at different rates as they dry. And you can try to even that out by covering it with plastic and really paying attention to what the different areas of the sculpture are doing. But once it reaches a certain size, and once you have so many little pieces involved, you pretty much inevitably reach a point where you just can't control the drying of each individual element, and you start to run into cracking happening at all of the places where they attach to each other. The other thing that you run into is that at a certain point, the pieces just become really brittle, because the bottom like, say that you do successfully build this thing, you know, kind of tall, and then you're ready to let it dry. At a certain point, the bottom is going to get a little bit more brittle than the top, and there's a good chance that the whole thing is just going to collapse, because once it dries, it's actually a little bit weaker than when it's leather hard. So paper clay also fixes that issue, because with the addition of paper inside it, it has 2 to 3 times the tensile strength as the same clay recipe without the paper. And when it dries, it ends up being a little bit more, it feels less brittle and more like a dry sponge, kind of. It doesn't have like a lot of give to it, but you can sort of tell that it's not the sort of thing that wants to snap very easily. So I really like working with it for structures that I want to build really slowly and tediously, because it lets me get away with making things that are complex but aren't going to break themselves when they start shrinking.
Is there a type of clay that shrinks less than others? What?
Yes. So generally speaking, the lower the temperature the clay is meant for, the lower the rate of shrinkage. And it also depends on the type of clays that are used in that clay. It depends on the amount of grog in that clay. But a good general rule is, and I don't know specifically the number for low fire because I don't work with low fire that often, but generally speaking, like stoneware and mid-range clays are going to shrink anywhere between like 8 and 12%, and porcelain is going to shrink anywhere between like 10 and 14%. This is a stoneware. It's like, oh, what all is in this? I know that this recipe shrinks about 10%, and without the paper and the grog, it would probably shrink around 12%.
What were the numbers you just said for porcelain?
Like 12 to 14 generally. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Oh, yeah, okay. So the other thing is that the slip is a paper clay slip, but it's not just paper clay. It's a combination of paper clay and what is called a stick-up slip. So a stick-up slip is a slip that has deflocculant in it, and deflocculant is what is used in casting slip to make it fluid without adding a whole lot of water to it. So this is yet another method to help with shrinkage, right? Because the only part of the structure that actually has fresh clay and therefore is going to shrink in, like, before it's fired, are the parts where I'm joining it together, which are also the parts that I want to shrink the least. So the clay doesn't have any deflocculant in it because all it needs to do is become dry, get broken up into little pieces, and then get stuck together. This, however, needs to do two things. It needs to not shrink very much, and it needs to be sticky. And deflocculant, it turns out, actually does both things. So in a casting slip, deflocculant is mainly working to, on the chemical level, it pushes the clay particles apart, which means that water can get in between them more easily. That means that you end up with a recipe that, like, normally might be fluid at 50% water and is now fluid at 30% water. Water content is one of the biggest places that shrinkage comes from in clay, because there generally is somewhere around 40 to 50% water. So when all of that evaporates, you end up with a lot less area. But when we replace a lot of the water with deflocculant, and then we also have grog and paper in here, we end up with something that is more of like a paste that will shrink a little bit, but is going to use the paper in it to bond to the surface enough that it's not going to break apart when it does shrink. So that is what is special about that. So with this piece, I started out building it just using this sort of like back and forth method of construction with the rods that I'm building with. And so far it's been relatively symmetrical, but I wanted to set it up so that it was at a point where we could sort of deviate from that for the demo. So now that we have what is essentially the armature of the sculpture, I want to talk a little bit about adding other things to it and combining different paper clay bodies with each other. Does anybody have questions so far? Sure.
I do. And I apologize, I missed the first 5 minutes.
Yeah.
But how much of this is intuitive and how much of this is sort of planned out?
That's a good question. Almost none of it is planned out. I will say this system of building is something that I've been doing for a while, so while I'm not like devising a specific plan, I think that there are times where I sort of have an idea of where it's going, and that's mainly based on like, I know that when I build with a repeated triangle, I'll get a semicircular curve, and I know that there's a couple different patterns that I can use to sort of encourage it to move in a direction, but when it comes to what the overall form of the sculpture is, yeah, I don't know. Yes?
Could you leave the paper pieces much larger? Could you make paper clay much bigger?
Oh, yeah.
And it would be fine?
Yes.
Okay.
And it's also, because it's so strong in the green state, it's also a good candidate for people who want to sculpt like monumentally large and make pieces that like a lot of the time you're limited by the size of kiln you have available, and a lot of times the size of kiln that you have available is going to be like, you know, person sized or smaller. So if you're wanting to make something that is monumental in scale, relatively lightweight for its size because there is all of this paper content in it, and strong enough that it can be exhibited without being fired, paper clay is also a really good candidate for that. Ashley Lyon is an artist to check out who makes a lot of like enormous figurative work that's all paper clay, mostly unfired, and
What was the name?
Ashley Lyon.
How do you spell the last name? Lyman?
Lyon, Lyon.
Ashley. Okay.
I had no idea that you could not fire it.
Totally. Yeah.
Is it, like, unfired clay is really brittle, and you're saying that paper clay is unfired is not?
Totally. So it will still snap in your hand, but
Not-
comparatively,
Yeah, okay.
yeah.
Because if I had done this with a, it would be in half.
And it's like, generally speaking, let's see if this works. Sometimes it does, other times it's embarrassing, but normally, nope. That one was not a strong candidate.
Can I try to, since it's already broken,
Yeah,
can
yeah.
I try to break it? Okay, so that one felt why would the two be different? Because the one I touched before.
Well,
the same
this box
pressure.
has been shipped to Arizona and back, so there is definitely a chance that some of the pieces in here are like,
Did you want to?
Yeah, pass it around.
you know, weakened from having been rattled around on a couple of flights from one state to the other. Let's see about this. There we go. Okay. But yeah, just generally speaking, like, especially like with porcelain, it makes a huge difference. Porcelain is particularly brittle when it's in the dry state compared to stoneware. And and the paper does a ton to help with the brittleness of that. Okay, let's see. We're on time-wise. Okay. All right, so as far as adding other types of pieces to this, so we have the rods that we can add to it. I also, at some point, usually decide that, like, while I like what is happening structurally, I want to do something a little bit more active because I do like building this way, but I also like to, like, actually touch clay at some point instead of just, So I have some fresh paper clay here. I will say this, one of the downsides of paper clay, if you're somebody who is grossed out by stuff like this, is that it does get moldy very quickly because it's full of paper and water. It usually, I mean, you can see in here, all of that nice marbling that we have is a nice colony of fungus that's taken up residence in there. It's totally harmless. It's the sort of fungus that grows on, like, grass and leaves and everything that we're breathing in on a daily basis. But it does get smelly, and if you have studio mates, you might hear about that at some point.
So you use it even with it moldy?
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of an inevitability for me because I build with such a small amount of material that, like, even if I only mix up a batch that's 1,000 grams, that's going to last me a couple weeks. And by that point, like, I made this 5 days ago and it's already, like, yeah.
If you use like distilled water or something?
No, I've found that, like, the water that you use doesn't seem to matter too much because a lot of time it's like all clay has some amount of mold and bacteria in it, and then once it gets wet, it's activated. You can put, like, in my slip, I'll put a little bit of vinegar in there, and that helps for a couple of days, but you definitely have to, like, re-administer frequently. Yeah. So, something that I have started doing with these sculptures is that I do like to actually come back in with fresh clay and start building a little bit more loosely on them. And this is something that I started doing last year, this specific method, where I'm using coils, but instead of coil building with them, I'm sort of making a coil network out of them. So I want to attach this coil here and here, so I'm going to actually, wait, now I should figure out specifically where I want to attach this. All right. So I'm flattening the ends out a little bit because I'm going to end up, like, spreading these into the surface to make sure that it's adhering well and sort of grabbing onto it. And then before I actually attach it, I just want to get a sense of how it's going to fit on there. Okay. So I'll wet those areas down. With these, I'm going to score the first two just a tiny bit. And this is kind of a delicate balance because I do want them to be roughed up a little bit so that the new clay will attach easier, but the things that I'm scoring are also very delicate, so I want to be a little bit cautious with that. All right.
Do your overall structures end up being pretty lightweight?
Oh, yeah. These ones can be a little bit less lightweight depending on the size of the rods that I'm using, because they vary from, like, this size to the, where's the big ones? This size. And it definitely, like, makes a difference. I like both ends of the spectrum for different things because the larger sizes are definitely a little bit more structural, but the lighter sizes do end up making a huge difference in weight.
So you made all those rods up ahead of time?
Yes, yeah. Well, my studio assistant did.
Aha.
So getting the first one on there can be a little bit tricky because you do need the second the second surface can be bone dry, but you need the surface of it to be wet while you attach this. I have this tiny little silicone tool that I really like for this because it does a good job of spreading the clay on there without distorting the curvy thing. Technical term. And as you may have gathered, my construction process is very slow. So I will often work on a piece like this for, I don't know, anywhere from like a couple of weeks to a couple of months. The construction that's already started on here is probably about like 5 or 6 hours of putting things together. And that is the other really nice aspect about being able to attach new paper clay to old paper clay. Because not only is it able to dry out and then have things added to it later, it's also a lot less finicky than most clays when it comes to the speed at which it needs to be dried out. So a lot of times, this also depends on your studio environment. If you're working somewhere really humid, like Kansas, for instance, it's a lot less of an issue. But if you're working in a drier studio environment, a lot of times if you leave a piece out to dry and you don't cover it with cloth or plastic or anything, it will dry quickly and it will dry unevenly, and this can lead to the piece cracking. Paper clay, I don't know this for sure, but I'm pretty sure it has to do with the fact that the paper inside does a good job of hanging on to water and naturally releasing it more slowly, on top of the fact that there's paper in there, which is making it shrink less along with the grog. But paper clay is really resilient when it comes to just being left out to dry at whatever speed it naturally wants to. So something that has been really helpful for me, especially because I'll be working on multiple projects in the studio at once and sometimes forget about them, is that I don't have to, get home at the end of the day and then be like, oh my god, I forgot to cover that thing, I gotta go back to the studio. And also when you're working on something that is being built with such small components over a long period of time, it's just nice to know that you don't have to worry about keeping track of it drying out on top of everything else.
Do you fire all of your pieces up?
Oh, yeah, just like generally? Yeah. Yes, and the firing part is where I personally run into the most issues, but the way that I work, I will end up integrating pieces that have already been fired into my work, and I'll end up firing things multiple times. So I'm not really working this way has really helped me let go of disappointment when things come out of the kiln, and of feeling like something cracking or breaking or changing shape in the kiln is necessarily the piece failing. I am also like, when it comes to the research and the ideas behind this body of work, a lot of my interest is in ecology, in the Anthropocene, and the way that environments are changing and shifting based on uh, human disruption. Um, and I think that, one of the things that I like about the way that the work reflects those ideas is that there's just sort of an acceptance that the work is constantly in a state of flux, uh, like an ecosystem. So by attaching things this way, I can get a little bit more of some organic forms going on in there. And the paper clay is a little bit less, you have to be kind of careful at this point specifically just because with all of that paper and grog in there, that means that there's less overall clay content. So it's going to be just a little bit less flexible and a little bit more prone to having like cracks on the surface of the clay, which is manageable. You just can't expect it to act exactly like you're used to the clay acting without the paper.
And how much does the amount of paper in the clay affect
Yes.
how it behaves?
That's a great question. I meant to talk about that earlier. Thank you. So, a lot. The more paper that you have, the less flexible and the less plastic the clay is going to be, but the more lightweight and the stronger it will be in the green state. So,
What about the fired state?
Yes, that is a trade-off because the paper burns out in the firing. So, in theory, the clay is going to be a little bit less strong after being fired than it would be if it were the same body without paper included. And I found that, like, you start to see the effects of the paper in the clay at as low as 2% paper. So at that point, you're not going to see any, like, real difference in the fired results because it's such a small amount of paper. The paper clay that I work with, I like to use somewhere between 6 and 8%. And I think that generally, I have heard of people working with it from anywhere from like 25 to 30%, which is way more than I've ever put into mine because it's just not what I need for what I'm doing. But I would think that that would make a lot more sense if you were building larger scale and potentially also not firing things. Because again, the more paper you add to it, the more lightweight it's going to be. And then if it's something that's large enough that you're not going to fire it anyway, having more paper in there is going to be more beneficial than not. So building with these little coils like this, it is a slow process, but once you sort of get going with it, I like it as a way to develop a lot of volume really fast. Really fast comparatively. And the reason that I started doing this initially is I used to be primarily a glass worker, and I did a lot of flame working, which is where you're working with the torch and the little rods of glass and bending them. So I didn't do a lot of blown work, but I made a decent amount of sculptural flame worked things where you're essentially like building a form out of all these little noodles. And it's something that I haven't done in a long time, but at some point I had the idea to try to sort of bring that aesthetic into the ceramic stuff that I'm doing, and never got around to it, sort of forgot about it, and then when I was introduced to paper clay as a way of working with it, I was like, oh, I think that this will work for that, because again, the main reason that that wouldn't have worked with normal clay is that it's such a tedious process that by the time you're trying to add new stuff to it, the old stuff is going to be dry and falling apart. Okay, so I also want to talk about slip trailers and slip construction, because this is a huge part of not what's going on here, but what is going on here. I have a little bit of it started here. So these like small gray dots in the middle are little slip trailed dots. In here I have also a paper clay stick-up slip that just has a black stain in it. And just like any of the other paper clay stuff, if I want to add new material to this, I just want to get it wet on the places where I'm going to add this. And for this, the elements that I'm adding and the elements that I'm attaching to are so small that I'm not going to bother with scoring it, partially because the water is able to be absorbed into them pretty easily and actually permeate them, and partially because I don't think I could score them if I tried to. So this is yet another method of construction that is very tedious and time-consuming, but essentially by adding one dot of slip at a time, I can start to build up these sort of networked structures. So I knew that I wanted to start doing that on this piece, but I also knew that I would not be able to actually demo that in real time in a way that would be satisfying. So I brought this piece along with me that already has some of that going on with it. So this is a good example of, I talked a little bit earlier about being able to use paper clay to build on things that have already been fired. So this piece has been fired, well, let's see. It's been bisque fired, it's been fired to cone 6 at least twice. I think I may have fired it to cone 04 at some point. But basically, a lot of my work involves like firing things and not necessarily considering glaze firing to be the end of the process. So I might do that for a couple of different reasons. One thing that I like to do is to start hot or at whatever is going to be the highest temperature. So if I'm working with a cone 10 clay, I might fire it to cone 10 and work down from there. With this piece, I'm firing it to cone 6 and working down from there. And there's a couple different advantages of this. One of them is like, say for instance that at this point I'm done firing it to cone 6, which may or may not be the case, I don't know yet. But this blue glaze in the middle is a cone 6 glaze, and I know that it's a cone 6 glaze that does not move anymore when you fire it to low fire temperatures, like 04, right? But I also use low fire glazes in my work, and occasionally I'll use low fire glazes in conjunction with new construction. So if I want to build something on this blue surface and have it act as a structural thing rather than a decorative element, firing it to cone 6 sort of locks that into place so that now it's part of the structure instead of part of the surface. But like we were saying about building on bone dry clay earlier, the same thing will happen normally if you're trying to build on clay that's already been fired with regular clay. It doesn't want to grab onto it, either because the surface is smooth or because it doesn't have any way to sort of attach itself to it. That water isn't being shared between the two pieces, and so your original piece is going to dry, shrink, and just pop off of the piece that's already been fired. But the other reason that you might want to do this is that sometimes, especially if you're building with the slip trailer, you'll reach a point where you've got this network of slip dots going, but it is not necessarily going to hold up structurally until it is fired and locked into place. So occasionally, before something gets out of hand, I will just fire it to cone 6, have it be locked in, and then come back and start building on it, because I know that with the paper clay stick-up slip, the shrinkage of the new clay and the old clay won't be significant enough to cause problems.
So you're not just using the glaze to attach it? Is that what's making it stick, or will it stick?
So yes, the paper clay will stick by itself.
Wow.
The one thing that
That's huge.
totally, and the one thing that I've had issues with it attaching to, which most of the time isn't in my work, so it's not much of an issue. If you have a glazed surface that is like totally smooth and glossy, sometimes it has trouble with that, because like regular clay, it's not sharing the water and there's no porosity, so it needs some kind of texture to grab onto. But even if it's just like, this little bit of rough texture here, or if it's the clay that's already been fired that isn't perfectly smooth, the paper clay will grab onto it. It's not necessarily as strong of a grip as glaze, so sometimes what I will do is I'll add material to it, and then I'll go back in with a lower fire glaze and just use that to like reinforce the areas where it's attaching to something else, but it will definitely hold itself on there enough to make it through a firing. So when I build like this, I usually like to have a couple different structures going at once, because I found out very quickly that if you are just working on one little area, you will spend a lot of time waiting for it to dry, and that's kind of a pain. So if you have a couple different networks set up, you can just sort of go around the piece, adding dots here and there, and by the time that you get back to the part that you were originally working on, you will probably be able to add more to it. So this is something that, like, it does start out pretty slow in the beginning, because there are only so many places that you can add new nodes to, but I have found that as you get further into the piece and the structures that you're making with the slip trailer get larger, you hit a point where it actually becomes kind of overwhelmingly fast, because there are so many places that you can add new dots to that you're just constantly like turning and using your slip trailer to add new material to it. So this is the primary and slowest way that I build with a slip trailer. I really kind of enjoy tedious processes. That might be apparent. But sometimes I do like to try to take up a little bit more space a little more quickly. So while some of these set up just a little bit, I'm going to talk a little bit about using the slip trailer to make components that can be added on later. So I brought a couple examples with me. These little pieces of geometry are slip-trailed components that these ones aren't quite all the way dry yet, but slip-trailed components that can be used as building blocks that are like very, very lightweight. If you want to pass it around. So, oh yeah, and if it breaks, it's fine. So the way that I'm building with these is I'm taking the paper clay slip, which again is going to shrink in a way where it's not going to break itself just by shrinking. So a lot of time, this is another place where it is different from regular slip. If you took regular slip, which has a higher water content and doesn't have any fiber in it, and you laid it out on the board like this, you would end up coming back the next morning and just having it like cracked in several areas because it wants to grab onto the wood and it wants to shrink apart from itself. Because this has both the paper and the deflocculant in it, when it dries, it separates itself from the wood just a little bit and shrinks a tiny bit, but it doesn't break apart. So when I initially lay these out, and they can be in lines, they can be in whatever shape you want them to be. You can essentially make like little decals with them if you want to as well, if you're like laying down a design, waiting for it to be leather hard, and then peeling it up and sticking it to something. But I generally like to use them as structural elements. So when I come back in the next day, this is probably kind of hard to see, but there's a flat side on this because of where it's laying against the wood. It is small enough that in some cases I feel like it's not noticeable to the point that it bothers me, but a lot of the time, especially if the piece is totally made of those, I like for it to be more three-dimensional. So what I do, for instance, to make these pieces that look like little bones is on this wear board, I have this sort of map of where I've previously laid out bone shapes. And on the first day, I'll take the slip and just sort of lay out a shape based on this imprint from previous times that I've done this. And I kind of want these to have a lot of texture, so I'm pretty loose about the way that I'm laying out this material.
Does it get clogged very often?
Hardly ever.
Really?
I do blend it up really well, and you definitely like, so I use grog for this, but it's a porcelain paper clay, so I'm specifically using fine mesh malachite, which is just porcelain grog. I have had clogging issues if I try to use anything above like fine grog, but for the most part, if it's like well blended, it's pretty good. So I'll lay these out like at something like this thickness, and then I'll come back in the next day, flip them over so that the flat side is up, and then I end up with something like this that is a three-dimensional object. And I really like this because I am not a computer person, and with the advent of 3D printed ceramics, I feel kind of left out of that whole thing. But now I can just, 3D print ceramics with a lot more labor and time and effort than it would probably actually take for me to just learn how to 3D print things. But no, I really enjoy working with it this way. And on that note, as far as the sort of imitating the 3D printing goes, let's see if these are dry enough to do this. Yeah. So you can also use it to build with lines on your piece, and this is something that I've had to experiment with a little bit because in order to, if you're building right on the piece, you can usually get it to stand up pretty well, right? So I can go back and forth here a couple times, and it is liquid, but it's kind of like pudding consistency. So I can't go super tall in one go, but this dries relatively quickly, and I can come back probably in 10 minutes or so and add another layer that's another like ½ inch. The other thing that I can do, oh, that's kind of folding over. The other thing that I can do is use it to build in between things, right? So if I want to keep building this out, but give it a little bit more structure that's not just the dots going out that way, I can carefully pull it between these things. And because it is viscous and has those fibers, and its low shrinkage rate, I should be able to get away with putting this sort of like webbing in between them without that coming apart. So yeah, I like this because I think it's a really versatile way to work with slip, not just for decoration, but for structure. Recently, I've started experimenting with pieces that are entirely made out of just dots of slip put together, which is incredibly tedious, but I will probably continue to do that. And yeah, I think we are almost out of time here. Does anybody have questions? I feel like that was a lot of information covered.
Do slip trailers come in different sizes as far as how much they extrude?
Yes,
Yeah,
totally.
we haven't really used those. And then was this slip trail also all that,
Yes.
that orange stuff?
Yeah. Oh, that's a good question. So this is an example, the orange stuff is an example of these pieces that have been laid out and then just using a slip dot attached, yeah.
Okay. It's really so intricate with the knife. I mean, that's what's so surprising. How intricate you can. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, totally.
It's
Thank you for coming. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys.